I had my phone to my ear before I even set down my overnight bag. Burn it all, I told my lawyer. No hello, no explanation. Just 3 words. The kind you only say when you know the game has already begun. The line went quiet for a second, like he was giving me one last chance to change my mind. You're sure, he asked. I've never been more sure in my life. It started less than an hour earlier. I'd just come off a 48-hour surveillance detail. The kind of assignment where you breathe too much recycled coffee and forget what day it is. Instead of going back to my apartment, I pointed the car toward the little house on the edge of town where my mother still lived. I didn't call. I didn't text. Something in my gut told me not to. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual for her, but the silence inside was wrong. Mama. My voice echoed through the hallway. She was in the kitchen, standing over the sink hands, submerged in a basin of soapy water. The late afternoon light caught the purple bloom on her right eye. Her knuckles were red and swollen, the skin scraped raw. She glanced at me, startled, for just a moment, then dropped her gaze back to the dishes. Don't worry about me, she said softly, like she was reading from a script she'd been handed years ago. I stepped closer. Who don't? The word was sharp this time, and she shook her head once. Just don't. I was still staring at her when my phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't recognize, just a link. I tapped it. And there he was, my father. On a yacht I didn't know he owned sunglasses, perched on his smug, face champagne flute raised. His other arm draped around a woman, maybe half his age, red dress blowing in the wind like she was in some cheap perfume ad. The caption read, "Life's too short not to enjoy the ride." My stomach tightened into a cold knot. I didn't say a word to my mother, didn't ask the obvious questions. I turned, walked down the hallway to the small room that had been my childhood bedroom. The posters were gone, but the furniture was the same. In the corner, a black safe sat beneath a folded quilt. I spun the combination and opened it. Inside was my service weapon, 2 boxes of evidence envelopes, and a slim leather case. I flipped it open. The gold shield of the Metropolitan Police glinted in the dim light. Underneath, tucked into the lining, was an envelope marked with the name of my lawyer's firm, Peterson and Hale. It had been there for months, sealed, waiting. I slipped the badge into my jacket pocket, the envelope under my arm, and stepped back into the kitchen. My mother didn't look up. I kissed her temple anyway. Back in my car, I sat for a moment, the weight of the badge pressing against my ribs. Every sound felt sharper. The rumble of a truck down the street, the faint barking of a dog 2 houses over, my own breath in my ears. I dialed my lawyer's private line. He answered on the second ring. "Detective." "Burn it all," I said. Silence then. That measured voice. "Once I start, there's no stopping. You know that. That's the point." When I hung up, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I'd seen that look before on suspects who knew the cuffs were about to close. Only this time, the look was mine. And the cuffs weren't for me. This wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about my father's predictable midlife crisis and his equally predictable arm candy. This was about the years my mother had swallowed her pain, the bruises that faded on the outside, but not inside. And it was about the quiet file I'd been building page by page every time a tip came across my desk about my father's business dealings. He'd built his fortune on control of money, of people, of her. And now, for the first time, control was about to slip from his hands. Because I wasn't just his daughter. I was a cop, and I knew exactly where to hit him so he couldn't get back up. I put the car in gear. The sun was setting, casting the street in gold and shadow. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless walking away from that house. I felt ready. The smell of lemon dish soap always takes me back. It's ridiculous the way a scent can rewind your bones like tape. One breath and I'm 10, again standing on the other side of the kitchen door, the wood grain pressed against my cheek so hard it leaves a pattern. The radio is on soft, always soft, and my mother is pretending to hum so I won't hear the rest. "Why is this house never quiet?" my father says, though the house is already church silent except for plates touching porcelain and that low music. His voice has volume, even when it's barely above a whisper. It's the kind of voice that makes the room obey. I remember the clink of a glass on the counter, the hitch in my mother's hum, a soft apology that sounds like wind through a cracked window. The apology is what angers him. It always does, as if her gentleness is an insult he must correct. People ask where cops come from. A handful of us are made at a kitchen sink. Back then, I had tactics. I memorized floorboards that didn't betray footsteps. I learned how to disappear into the utility closet with a Walkman and pretend I couldn't hear the argument morph into a one-sided storm. I learned to smile at school when a teacher asked about the purple mark my mother got from bumping into a cabinet. I learned that cabinets are the clumsiest killers of women in our town. Sometimes my mother would come into my room after the house went to sleep. She'd sit on the edge of the bed, fingertip tracing the seam of the blanket. In the glow from the hallway, nightlight, her face looked both older and somehow lit from within. "Baby," she'd whisper the word, a promise and a plea. "Don't worry about me." The line would have sounded noble in a movie. In real life, it felt like a sentence we were both serving. My father wasn't always a monster. That's the hardest part to tell people who want easily sorted villains. There were Sundays he'd make pancakes, his forearms dusted with flour, like he'd been out in the snow. There were photographs of him in a suit, laughing with his hand on my shoulder, the two of us squinting into the sun at a park. There were gifts, flashy, excessive apologies disguised as generosity, and granted on a timetable only he knew. Control can look like kindness if you squint hard enough. He ran his construction company the way he ran our house. Immaculate schedules numbers that added up crews that didn't question, cash flow through the business like a river he could turn with a wrench. I didn't understand the way money moved then, but I understood the silence it purchased. When I was 16, I got a job bagging groceries. It was glorious the way my feet hurt for honest reasons. I learned the price of things. I learned that when you buy eggs at the end of a shift, you carry them home like a crown. I also learned that my father did not like me working. He didn't like his family visible in the world without him. He didn't like that I came home with the scent of other people's dinners on my clothes and my own coins in my pocket. "You don't need to do that," he said, standing in the front hall with the receipt I'd left on the table. "We're not that kind of people." "We're the kind of people who eat," I said before I'd learned the value of strategic silence. He didn't hit me. He didn't have to. The look did it, the way his gaze skimmed my face and landed behind me like I wasn't worth the friction of a direct strike. He didn't speak to me for 3 days. I learned that absence is also a weapon. The night I turned 18, I filled out the application for the academy while he watched the evening news. When I told my mother, she put both hands to her mouth like she'd witnessed a magic trick and was afraid clapping would break it. When I told my father, he laughed. "You," he said. "In a uniform, sweetheart, no." He said it like he was offering me a favor, like his refusal could save me from myself. I went anyway. The academy was a sanctuary because it was honest about pain. You did push-ups until your arms shook, not because someone felt like it, but because you were building a life that depended on strength. You ran until your lungs burned, because someday you might have to run towards someone who was screaming. You learned to hold a stance, to let your mind do the math, even when your body wanted to bolt. The drills gave me a language for what I'd been practicing in the dark breath-focused command restraint. There was a day on the range when the instructor corrected my grip and said, "Trust your hands." He meant, let the muscle memory carry you, but something deeper clicked. My hands, my choice, my life. The first domestic call I responded to as a rookie made my knees buzz under my uniform pants. The dispatcher's voice was clipped. Neighbors heard shouting possible injury. My training officer, a woman named Morales, who smelled like spearmint gum and solved problems with the precision of a surgeon, met my eyes as we turned onto a narrow street. "Don't decide the ending before you know the story," she said. The house was tidy. They usually are. The woman who opened the door wore a sweatshirt with the sleeves tugged past her knuckles. Her hair was damp, like she'd just washed it to erase the evening. A man hovered behind her in the hallway. He had the loose swagger of someone who believed the room belonged to him. "Everything okay here?" Morales asked. The woman smiled too quickly. "We're fine." The man answered for her a fractional second later. We're fine. Morales didn't fight their words. She let the silence bear weight until it sagged. Ma'am, could we speak in the kitchen? She asked, and the woman nodded. I watched the man's jaw. He didn't like losing the center of the room. In the kitchen, the lemon dish soap sat by the sink. I felt my throat close. Morales spoke softly, like a friend. She asked if there were any injuries. The woman shook her head, eyes on the countertop, and then her sleeve slipped. The bruise on her wrist was the color of thunderheads. We didn't raise our voices. We didn't hand the man a lecture. We separated them. We documented. We offered resources. We did the slow, steady work of making a door where there had only been a wall. As I wrote the report, the man's voice floated from the living room. This is all a misunderstanding. She's dramatic. The words were perfectly rehearsed. I'd heard an older version of them my whole life. When we left the porch, light flicked on automatically. The air outside was cool enough to sting my lungs. Morales looked at me. You okay? She asked. I'm fine, I said, and it didn't sound like a lie. She studied my face for a second longer. You held the line, she said. That matters. Back in the cruiser, I stared at my hands on the steering wheel. They didn't shake. I remembered my father's laugh when I said I was joining up the way he rolled the word uniform around like a joke. I remembered my mother's whisper through the years. Don't worry about me. I did worry. The difference was, worry now had edges. It had a badge. It had a procedure that could be written and signed. The past didn't vanish because I put on a uniform, but it had to stand at attention while I walked through it. People like to pretend there's a moment when the child becomes the adult, when the line is sharp and visible, a bright stripe across the floor. It isn't like that. It's a series of echoes, doors clicking shut, pens scratching forms, radios crackling with places you'll never see, and people you'll never know asking for help. You answer, and the echo lands in your chest, and you drive toward the sound. In training, they taught us how to draw a perimeter. I started drawing one around my mother, even before I knew I was doing it. I learned her routines. I learned which neighbors kept their porches lit, who heard things who didn't. I learned the sound of my father's car when it turned onto her street. Years later, when the yacht photo glowed on my phone, none of this was random. None of it was heat-of-the-moment rage. It was a perimeter closing. I once asked Morales how she slept carrying everyone else's nights. She shrugged. I plant something, she said. It's hard for fear to live in the same house as a tomato. I planted different things. Files, names, dates, a timeline that could stand up in court, a plan that didn't depend on anyone being brave at the worst possible time. My father had taught me the architecture of control. I was repurposing it. When I picture my childhood now, I don't see only the bruises. I see chalk lines on a driveway, my mother teaching me hopscotch, the numbers so bright they made their own light. I see the way her mouth tilted when she cut an apple and slid the best slice onto my plate. I see, too, the night she held the steering wheel in the driveway and didn't start the car, her knuckles white and still. We sat there breathing the same air, both pretending a decision hadn't just slid between us like an extra passenger. Don't worry about me, she said, then not like a plea, but like an order. I obeyed. I worried about everything else instead. And I made myself a promise for the day she would need me to break that order. Lemon dish soap. Chalk dust. The click of a safe. Some families inherit heirlooms. We inherit sounds. Mine were enough to build a life, and when the time came to dismantle a lie. I didn't start keeping tabs on my father out of revenge. At least, that's what I told myself in the beginning. It started with a slip. A document that came across my desk one Tuesday afternoon when the station's printer jammed and I had to dig through a mess of mixed pages. Buried between a stack of parking citations was a subpoena request from another precinct white-collar crimes unit seeking records for a holding company I recognized. The name was generic enough, North Shore Development, LLC, but the registered agent address was my father's office. I could have handed it back, pretended I'd never seen it. Instead, I read it twice and slipped the page into a manila folder before anyone could notice. That was 2 years ago. From there, the folder grew. Slow, deliberate, like a sapling taking root. Bank statements I pulled from public court filings. property records tied to shell companies with names my father liked to joke about at family dinners. Photos of him meeting with men whose reputations kept them off most social ledgers, but not out of the business pages. I didn't have a grand plan at first, just a gnawing need to understand the machinery that kept my mother under his thumb. As a cop, you learn that abuse isn't just bruises and shouting. It's contracts you don't understand until they own your house. It's credit cards you didn't know were in your name until the debt arrives. It's making someone believe they can't survive without you because you've woven their entire world from threads you hold in your hand. My father had made himself the loom and the weaver. And my mother, for all her quiet resilience, still clung to the threads. She refused divorce when I suggested it. It would destroy me, she said, and I couldn't tell if she meant financially, emotionally, or both. So I stopped talking about leaving and started preparing for taking. My lawyer, Henry, wasn't just a name on a brass plate. He'd been around since my academy graduation, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of mahogany and patience. He didn't ask why I wanted property searches run on my father's companies. He didn't comment when I brought him photos of yacht registrations and invoices for remodeling projects in cities my father had no business in. He just said, "We'll build a box. And when it's strong enough, we'll drop it over him." I like the image. Quiet, controlled. No wild confrontations, no screaming matches that could be dismissed as a daughter's spite. Just a box. The Mistress. Her name was Elise, came into the picture a little over a year ago. She was a licensed real estate broker, smooth as glass in her social media posts, always leaning just enough into the camera to catch the neckline of whatever she was wearing. My father paraded her through high-end charity events like she was both prize and proof. A little digging, and I saw her signature on at least 3 property transfers into shell companies connected to my father. That's when Henry's box got sturdier. We connected her commissions to properties bought and flipped at improbable profit margins. We traced cash infusions from accounts in the Caymans into corporate holdings in her brother's name. It was the kind of web where you didn't know if you were mapping fraud or laundering or both, but you knew there was a spider at the center. Meanwhile, I played my role. Birthdays, holidays, the occasional stiff lunch where my father would ask about my cop work with the same tone someone might use to ask about a child's hobby. I'd nod, offer safe anecdotes about traffic stops or neighborhood watch meetings. All the while, I was taking mental inventory, the watch on his wrist, the tan line from a ring he no longer wore the way he paid cash for the bill, even at restaurants that knew his name. He never asked about my love life. I realized later it was because in his mind, I belonged to the job, to the badge. He assumed that meant I was alone. That was his first mistake. The second was underestimating Henry. We'd been sitting on the file for nearly 6 months, adding layers. Domestic abuse photos I'd convinced my mother to let me take just in case. Copies of her medical records with suspiciously vague injury descriptions. A thumb drive of Elise's real estate closings that just happened to match dates when my father's account saw large incoming wires. We were ready to move by the start of summer. Then came the yacht photo. It was almost theatrical the way it arrived. Anonymous number, no message, just the image. Like someone else had decided I'd waited long enough. When I called Henry from the car and said, "Burn it all," I knew he would understand. In our shorthand, it meant activate every legal avenue at once. File for an emergency protective order for my mother. Serve subpoenas for financial records. Notify the DA's office of potential fraud and abuse cases. This wasn't going to be a family spat in a divorce court. This was going to be a multi-front siege. I also knew my father would come out swinging. He'd never lost control in his life. Not in business, not in marriage, not in the image he'd built so carefully that people in town still described him as a pillar. Pillars, I'd learned, were just things you could topple if you found the right crack. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder spread out in neat lines. Years of notes, receipts, and cross-references. I stared at the first document, the subpoena from that printer jam, and thought about how one stray piece of paper had started this avalanche. Some people believe in fate. I believe in bad men leaving breadcrumbs because they think no one is hungry enough to follow. The next morning, Henry called. "We're live," he said simply. I asked, "What's first bank accounts?" he said. They'll be frozen by noon. He'll know something's wrong by lunch. I imagined my father sitting at a table with Elise ordering wine, reaching for his phone when the card was declined. I imagined the way his smile would falter, the controlled tone he'd use with the waiter. I imagined the cracks starting to form. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't just feel ready, I felt ahead. Henry didn't waste time. By the time I rolled into the precinct's parking lot that morning, he'd already sent over a list of everything in motion: court petitions, asset freeze orders, subpoenas. The protective order for my mother was at the top of the list, bolded. It was the kind of move you didn't reverse once it hit the system. I sat in my unmarked car badge on my hip, reading the emails on my phone. I could almost feel the gears turning in rooms I couldn't see: clerks stamping papers, bank compliance officers forwarding urgent memos, process servers knocking on polished office doors with manila envelopes that carried more weight than any bullet. Step 1 was about money. My father's wealth was his fortress, and he'd built high walls. But money in a bank was just numbers in a database, and numbers could be locked with a keystroke. By noon, the main corporate accounts and 3 personal ones were frozen pending investigation. Step 2 was about paper trails. Subpoenas went out to 2 title companies, 3 banks, and a brokerage. Elise's real estate firm made the list, which meant she'd be getting a very official visitor sometime in the next 48 hours. Step 3 was the protective order: emergency no contact. It gave my mother the legal shield she'd never had before. I knew it wouldn't stop him from trying to reach her, but now every text or call could be a violation with teeth. The hardest part was getting her to agree. I drove back to her house, after my shift, not in uniform. She was in the living room, folding laundry into small, neat stacks like she always did when she was anxious. The TV was on low, a rerun of some home renovation show. "I need you to sign this," I said, setting the papers on the coffee table. She glanced at them, then at me. "What is it, protective order?" Her face tightened. "I told you, I don't want to, Mama." I interrupted gently, sitting on the edge of the couch. "This isn't about making a scene. This is about giving you space he can't legally cross. If he calls, if he shows up, we have recourse. Without it, he can say and do whatever he wants." She folded a towel, slowly pressing the edges flat with her palm. "And you think that'll stop him?" I leaned in, lowering my voice. "No, but it'll stop him from thinking he's untouchable. And it gives me us leverage." She stared at the paper for a long time. Then quietly, "You've been planning this." "Yes," I said. No apology, no hesitation. Her hands lingered on the pen before she signed. That night, I met Henry at his office. The place smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of space that made you want to whisper. He had maps and flowcharts taped to the wall, lines of connection drawn in red between company names and account numbers. "This is where it gets noisy," he said, tapping a section of the chart where Elise's name was circled. "Once she's served, your father will know we're not just circling the wagons. We're coming straight for the gate." I studied the chart. "Good. Let him know." Henry gave me a look. "Detective, once this starts, he's going to try to hit back. Hard. He'll call in favors. He'll smear you if he can. I've been a cop long enough to know that the truth doesn't shout, but it survives," I said. 2 days later, the first crack in his composure showed. My phone rang while I was writing a case report. The caller ID flashed his name. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. 5 minutes later, a text. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I didn't reply. Another text followed. "This isn't a game. You're making a mistake you can't fix." I put the phone face down and finished my report. Every message he sent now was just another piece of evidence. By the end of the week, Elise's name was all over my feeds, not because of her dresses or her yacht trips, but because her real estate firm had been temporarily closed pending investigation. Rumors spread fast in the circles my father moved in. People didn't care about the details. They cared about the stain. I got a call from Morales, my old training officer. Saw the news. "You finally pulling a thread." Something like that. "Well," she said, "don't stop until the whole sweater's gone." The real turning point came on a Thursday morning. Henry called at 7:15 a.m. "We got the judge," he said. "Full access to his corporate ledgers for the last 10 years. That was the equivalent of opening every locked drawer in his life. Contracts, payouts, under-the-table deals, all now potential exhibits. I hung up and sat there in my kitchen coffee, cooling in my hands, thinking about my father's favorite line, "You can't fight what you can't see." He was about to find out what happened when someone saw everything. Later that day, I drove past the marina where he kept the yacht. It was there gleaming in the sun, but quiet, no music, no movement. I parked far enough away that no one would notice me watching. I thought about the photo on my phone, the way his smile had looked so effortless, so certain. He'd posted it to tell the world he was untouchable. I'd kept it to remind myself he wasn't. The plan was moving now faster than even I expected. And the best part, every step was by the book. No favors, no bending the rules, just the slow grind of law and process, the same machinery he'd used to protect himself now turning against him. When you work in law enforcement, you learn patience. But you also learn that once momentum builds, you don't stand in its way, you aim it. I wasn't aiming for an arrest. Not yet. I was aiming for the moment when he realized that every exit was already locked. It started with a letter that looked expensive. Heavy cream stock, raised lettering that tried too hard. A messenger dropped it at my precinct front desk like he was delivering a crown. Inside, a demand for immediate cessation, a threat of defamation claims, and language polished to a mirror sheen promising ruin. My father's attorneys in army and pinstripes had arrived. Henry read it once and set it down like a napkin. "Noise," he said. "They want you rattled." "I've been rattled before," I said. It didn't last. The next volley came by phone. A deputy chief called me into his office. He had his coat on the back of his chair and a careful neutrality on his face. "Your father placed a call," he said, steepling his fingers. "He's alleging misuse of departmental resources for a personal matter." Did he specify which resources I supposedly misused? Vaguely? Time, access, the prestige of the badge. He studied me. "I'm telling you because transparency matters." I told him any complaint must be formal and in writing. "If one arrives, internal affairs will do their job." "I expect them to," I said. He nodded a small approval. "Stay clean, leave a paper trail. You know the drill." I live in the drill. Walking back to my desk, the station smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner, and the hint of rain that had blown in on half-open doors. The familiar noise steadied me. A radio squawk, the hum of fluorescent lights, the low laughter from patrol returning with soggy uniforms. If my father wanted to drag me into the dark, he'd have to get past an entire building of people who knew what honest work looked like. Elise went loud online. Her first post was a selfie with a caption that read like a press release. "Women in business are always targets. Envy is a disease." The comments were a mix, fawning, furious, confused. By afternoon, a second post, a carefully lit shot of a wrist, faintly red where a bracelet had allegedly irritated the skin. Abuse from whom she wrote. 42K likes a colleague, muttered, scrolling past. I felt something old and hot in my chest, but I let it pass. You can't argue with a hurricane by yelling at the wind. We pivoted. Henry filed a motion to compel production on one of Elise's closings that stank like a fish market in August. We requested the full chain of emails, not just summaries. She'd either comply or she'd blink. Either option told us something. My father kept calling. I stopped listening to his voicemails, but Henry insisted on archiving them. That night at my kitchen table, we played them through his laptop for the record. My father's voice was a metronome of control, soft, then sharp. Conciliatory, then cruel. "Sweetheart, this is beneath you. These theatrics, this persecution." Click. "You're making a public fool of your mother. Do you want that?" Click. "If you keep this up, you'll regret it. I will not be destroyed by my own child." Henry paused the playback and glanced at me. "He's performing for an audience of one himself. And his attorneys?" I said. "He wants a judge to hear these and think I'm unhinged." "Great," Henry said dryly. "Let them hear the subtext. Men like this always reveal themselves in the second paragraph." The smear widened. A local gossip site ran a piece prominent business leader harassed by estranged daughter, a police detective. There was a photo of me leaving the courthouse, face carved by noon sun into something harder than I felt. The article quoted sources close to the family who described my mother as fragile and suggested I was reliving adolescent grievances. The comments were vicious and also weirdly supportive. A retired nurse wrote a paragraph that started, "I used to see women come in with stories about cabinets." I printed that one and slid it into the folder. Not because it was evidence, but because it was truth. 2 days later, Henry called with a tone I'd never heard from him, alert, almost eager. "We have a visitor," he said. "Says he's your father's former partner from the early days, named Frank Delaney." Frank arrived in a suit that had seen better years and a tie that had given up. He was 60-something, with hands like he'd done real work before money taught him to hire it out. He didn't sit until I did, as if he needed to decide whether I'd earned the story he'd brought. "You look like your mother," he said, then caught himself. That was meant as a compliment. "It is," I said. He folded his palms, anchored himself, and began. They'd started the company in a rented garage with borrowed tools and a ledger book. My father had been brilliant with numbers and merciless with everything else. It worked until it didn't. "We were young," Frank said. "He had ideas, I had hands. Then the ideas turned into shortcuts. The shortcuts turned into, let's call them efficiencies that didn't meet code. He told us about jobs bid low and padded later with unforeseen costs, about inspectors who suddenly became reasonable after lunch, about a worker who fell from a scaffolding and was paid in cash to keep quiet, except the man's wife didn't stay quiet. There was paperwork, there were signatures, there were checks written from accounts with names I recognized. And at home, I asked because sometimes the ledger you need is not only the one with numbers." Frank's jaw tightened. He was the same, he said. He believed people were raw material. You mold them or you crush them, but you never meet them where they are. He slid a battered envelope across Henry's desk. Inside, copies of invoices, a calendar with initials next to payment dates, and my breath caught 2 photographs from the scaffolding incident. The injured man's name was scrawled on the back in blue ink. "Why now?" Henry asked. "Because I watched the news," Frank said. "Because I knew your mother once. Because the girl who used to keep score on her fingers at the company picnic shouldn't be the only one carrying this." There are moments in a case when the room shifts, not because of volume, but because gravity changes. This was one of those moments. We had been aiming for my father's money. Now with Frank's materials, we were angling towards something worse, a pattern of endangerment, possibly criminal negligence, the kind that gets the district attorney to stop by in person. Henry's eyes flicked to me. "This widens the field," he said. "We're not just in family court and banking records anymore. We're in worker safety insurance fraud bribery. If even half of this holds, the state will want a piece." I felt a strange steadiness settle in. This was no longer just my mother's bruises and my father's yacht. This was a map of harm that radiated outward employees, buyers, the city that had approved buildings on paper that might be different in concrete. That night, the sky broke open and rain drummed the roof like fingertips. I made tea. I didn't drink. Paced the length of my apartment while the kettle cooled and tried to catch every feeling as it flashed anger. Yes. Relief. Yes. And something that felt like grief for the version of the world where this could have been smaller. My phone buzzed. Morales. "You holding up?" "Yes," I wrote. "We have a witness. Old partner." "Good," she replied. "People like your father build mazes. Witnesses are doors." The next morning, the maze fought back. My father's firm filed an emergency motion to quash the subpoenas, arguing fishing expedition, claiming our requests were harassing and overbroad. Henry smiled without humor. "They're playing calendar games," he said. "If they can stall a week, they'll move assets or rewrite stories. We're not giving them a week." We didn't. Henry filed a response within hours, attaching Frank's documents and requesting an expedited hearing. He added a line that made me sit up straighter. "The pattern alleged herein endangers not only the petitioner's mother, but the public." The judge set the hearing for Monday. Elise posted a sunset photo from an unnamed coastline with the caption, "They can't cancel what's real." The comments were a bonfire. Some defended her, others posted links to articles about the investigation. She replied to none of them, which told me she'd finally listened to counsel. Sunday evening, I drove out to my mother's house with a bag of groceries and a bouquet of grocery store tulips that looked sillier than I'd intended. She was cooking spaghetti too much garlic the way I liked it. We ate quietly, the sauce splattering red moons onto plates. "You don't have to stay," she said after folding foil over a pan. "I know," I said, "but I want to see you lock the door behind me." She did. The deadbolt clicked, the chain slid, and that small music was somehow louder than thunder. On the porch, the air smelled like wet grass and impending trial. I drove home with the wipers on full and my badge on the passenger seat, a small golden moon catching streetlight. The counterattack had made noise. It had tried to rattle and smear and stall, but I had my own army, one built of paper photographs, honest men with tired ties and women who'd stopped apologizing for saying what they saw. On Monday, the courthouse would open like a throat and we'd step inside with our words sharpened. For the first time since I'd said burn it all, I understood what we were actually burning. Not a person, not even a reputation, but the shelter he'd built for his lies. Monday morning smelled like rain-soaked stone and strong coffee. The courthouse steps were slick, the kind of slick that could put you on your back if you weren't paying attention. I climbed them slowly, deliberately, my badge in my purse instead of on my belt. This wasn't a day for uniforms. It was a day for precision. Inside, the air was cooler than it needed to be, humming with fluorescent light. The echo of heels on marble was punctuated by murmured greetings between lawyers in dark suits. Henry was already waiting outside the courtroom, one hand in his pocket, the other balancing a slim leather portfolio. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. "Is he here?" Henry's eyes flicked toward the double doors, front row center, Elise next to him. We walked in together. My father was exactly where Henry said, center seat in the gallery, wearing a navy suit and a smirk that didn't quite fit his eyes. Elise sat beside him in a cream blouse, lips pressed into something that could pass for either concern or calculation. They looked like they were posing for a magazine about people who believed they'd already won. The judge entered, mid-50s, square-shouldered, reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. She didn't waste time. "Counsel, are we prepared to proceed?" Henry rose. "We are, Your Honor." Opposing counsel, a man with silver hair and an expression like polished granite, followed suit. "We are, Your Honor." However, he began some protest about the scope of our subpoenas, but the judge held up a hand. "You'll have your turn. Petitioner, begin." Henry started with the protective order. He laid out the photos of my mother's injuries, each one marked with dates and signed by the attending physicians. The room was quiet except for the faint rustle of paper as the judge turned each page. My father's lawyer objected to relevance. The judge overruled him. "Go on," she said. Henry moved to the financials. Spreadsheets appeared on the overhead screen, corporate ledgers showing transfers to holding companies, then to Elise's brokerage. Property sale dates matched with wire receipts from offshore accounts. My father's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Then came Frank. He walked to the stand slowly, one hand brushing the railing for balance. His voice was steady as he recounted the scaffolding incident, the off-book settlement, the inspector lunches. He named names. He produced copies of invoices signed in my father's hand. Each document hit the record like a stone in water ripples moving outward. My father's lawyer tried to shake him on cross-pressing on dates and memory. Frank didn't flinch. "I kept records," he said, tapping the envelope in front of him. "Not because I knew this day would come, but because I knew the truth doesn't live in your head. It lives in ink." Elise's turn came next. Henry didn't call her. The DA did. I hadn't expected the district attorney's office until that moment. A young prosecutor in a charcoal suit stepped forward, introducing herself and informing the court that her office had opened a parallel criminal investigation based on the evidence submitted. The judge leaned back in her chair. "Proceed." The prosecutor displayed a set of closing documents from Elise's firm, highlighting inconsistencies between sale prices and reported commissions. Elise shifted in her seat, her fingers curling tight in her lap. These documents, the prosecutor said, show a pattern of inflated valuations funneled through limited liability companies connected to the respondent. The proceeds, she tapped a page, were then moved offshore within 24 hours. My father's lawyer objected, arguing this was a civil matter. The judge disagreed. Fraud is fraud, she said. If the DA's office sees probable cause, they have my leave to continue. It was my mother's testimony that cut through the room like glass. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She just told the truth in a tone so steady it was impossible to doubt. She described years of being told she couldn't survive without him, how the finances were always too complicated for her to understand, how the bruises weren't anyone's business. The DA asked why now? She glanced at me, then back at the prosecutor. Because my daughter showed me the box she'd built, and I realized I didn't have to live inside his. The courtroom was still enough to hear the HVAC hum. By the time Henry rested our case, my father's posture had shifted. The smirk was gone. His shoulders leaned forward, elbows braced on the table. Elise sat slightly apart now, her body angled toward the aisle. The judge took a moment before speaking. Based on the evidence presented, I am granting the protective order in full. All joint accounts are to remain frozen pending further investigation. The respondent will produce complete corporate ledgers within 10 business days. Furthermore, she glanced at the DA. This matter is referred for criminal review. A murmur rippled through the gallery. My father turned his head, then just enough to look at me. The disbelief in his eyes was almost worse than the anger, as if he couldn't fathom that someone had dismantled his fortress from the inside out. I didn't blink. We filed out in a slow procession. Reporters clustered near the courthouse steps, cameras ready. Henry kept his voice low. You know this isn't over. I know, I said. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp with petrichor. Somewhere behind me, I heard Elise decline to answer a question, her heels clicking away fast. My father didn't speak to the press. For a man who loved the spotlight, that silence said more than any headline. I paused at the curb, looking back at the courthouse, its columns, its symmetry, its promise that the law was still a place where truth could stand. Today, at least it had. And tomorrow, we'd be one step closer to making it permanent. The part no one tells you about justice is the quiet. Headlines thunder for a day, the courthouse echoes for a week, but real accountability settles like snow, soft, persistent, changing the shape of everything without a sound. Months passed. Winter slid its shoulder against the town. The DA's office moved like a glacier with teeth. My father's attorneys tried their last tricks, continuances, character letters, a motion to exclude the scaffolding photos on the grounds that time dulls truth. The judge denied it with a line I wrote on a sticky note and kept in my wallet, truth scuffs. It doesn't fade. In March, the plea deal arrived. Fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit bribery, criminal endangerment. He took it. Not because he was sorry my father used apologies the way some men used cufflinks, but because he finally recognized the math. Prison time was on the table either way. He chose the smaller number and the cleaner narrative. The DA insisted on restitution workers harmed buyers, misled city fines back taxes. The amount made even me sit down. Elise cut a separate deal. Cooperation in exchange for avoiding prison, a lifetime ban from real estate licensure, a fine that turned her careful posture into a slump at the defense table. In her last interview with the DA, she said 3 words that surprised me. I was scared. The prosecutor asked, of whom Elise stared at the table. Everyone, she said, and it sounded truer than anything she posted online. The day the judge accepted my father's plea, the courtroom felt like a house we'd finally aired out. My mother sat in the second row beside Henry, hands folded on a modest navy skirt. She wore no makeup. She didn't need armor that day. When the judge asked if any victims wished to speak, my mother glanced at me. I nodded once. She stood and approached the lectern. Her voice didn't tremble. I am not here to punish, she said. Punishment already arrived years ago in my kitchen in front of my sink. I am here to make sure harm ends where we choose to end it. The judge listened, chin resting in one palm. My father stared at the table, jaw tight. My mother finished with a sentence that tasted like water in a dry month I intend to live. Outside reporters thrust microphones toward us. Henry gave a brief statement. My mother smiled politely and said nothing. I touched the badge in my purse and kept moving. I didn't owe the cameras any more of my family than the record already held. We drove straight from the courthouse to the bank. The clerk handed my mother a folder sheets to sign accounts, to transfer liens, to anticipate. My mother read every word. She asked questions that made the clerk sit up straighter. She signed, carefully pressing her name like a seed into fresh soil. On the way home, she looked out the passenger window at a sky the color of clean steel. I thought it would feel like fireworks, she said. What does it feel like? Like a door closing, she said, and a window opening somewhere I can't see yet. We found the window in April on a coastal road where salt turned mailbox flags chalk white. The cottage my mother fell in love with was a small square of mercy, 2 bedrooms, a worn porch, a kitchen that begged for lemon soap and sunlight. The realtor, not Elise, never again kept apologizing for the garden, a tangle of weeds and stubborn soil. We'll fix it, my mother said. And when she said we, she meant we. I hauled boxes. She made lists. We talked about paint colors and which room would hold the old piano we'd rescued from a neighbor's garage sale in '98. We did not talk about my father. Not because we were pretending he didn't exist, but because his existence no longer set the tempo in our house. On the first Saturday in the cottage, I built a rectangle of wood on the sunniest corner of the yard and filled it with soil that smelled like rain waiting to happen. My mother came outside with a tray of seedlings bought with small, delighted gilt tomatoes, basil, 2 strawberries whose leaves looked like folded napkins. Morales says fear and tomatoes can't live in the same house, I told her, knees in the dirt. Morales is right, my mother said, placing a seedling in my hand as if handing me a delicate decision. Let's see if it's true for gardens. We planted in companion pairs, basil beside tomato marigold to keep pests away. I showed her how to water the roots, not the leaves. She showed me how to hum, not to drown out noise, but to invite bees. The sun came down like a blessing nobody asked permission to give. The first letter from my father arrived in May, forwarded from Henry's office. I waited 3 days before opening it, standing at the kitchen counter with a butter knife because it was the only blade within reach. He wrote about misunderstandings, about being led astray by associates, about the cruelty of public opinion. He wrote about me like I was a weather event, a storm that damaged the coast but spared the lighthouse. He did not write the words I had sometimes pictured late at night, like a child rehearsing grace before dinner. I folded the letter back along its creases and put it in a drawer. It wasn't for my mother to carry. It wasn't for me to swallow. It was paper. I let it be paper. June came and warmed the tomatoes into fat, green promises. My mother learned to tie them gently to stakes. She wore a sun hat that made her look like a photograph from a book about a country where people kept their promises. I visited twice a week, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on my cases. When I left, she locked the door and waved from the porch a small triumphant motion, like a captain acknowledging calm seas. Work didn't stop just because my personal storm had shifted. Domestic calls still rolled in. Some houses were tidy, some were not. I stood in kitchens and recognized the angle of a woman's shoulders, the way a man filled a doorway, as if he could own a person the way he owned a truck. I did my job. I drew perimeters. I wrote reports that fit like hinges, smooth and strong. At the end of a long Thursday, Henry called with an idea that landed so quietly, I almost missed the sound of it. There's restitution money, he said. More than your mother will need. We could let it sit and gather polite interest. Or we could move it. Move it where? A fund, he said. Small grants for women leaving violent homes. First month rent locks a used car fees to change a name if they need it. Practical help. No speeches. I thought of the file that began with a jammed printer. I thought of the box we built. I thought of tomato steaks. Call it what I asked? Henry hesitated. Your call. I looked at my hands. They were dirty from the garden, even after 2 showers soil, holding on in the half-moons of my nails. A sentence rose uninvited, and I didn't push it away. Not. Burn it all, I said. We already burned what needed burning. What then? Begin again? The paperwork took a month. The first disbursement took 12 minutes after we opened the account, a woman from 3 towns over who needed a locksmith and a bus ticket in the same afternoon. Henry called me after he approved it. We'll keep it quiet, he said. It doesn't need our names. In July, the first tomato reddened like a slow sunrise. My mother plucked it with both hands, laughing in a way I hadn't heard since I was little enough to be carried. We sliced it thin and ate it over the sink with salt juice running down our wrists. It tastes like a decision, she said. That night, the ocean sounded like steady breathing. I stepped onto the porch with my phone and typed a message I'd been putting off, something simple, for the people who had followed the story, strangers and neighbors and nurses who remembered cabinets. I wrote slowly, like planting. If you've listened this far, thank you. If any part of this sounds like your house, know this doors can open. Help can be quiet and still be real. If you want to keep walking with us, share this with someone who needs a map or stay for the next story. We'll keep a light on the porch. I hit send and put the phone face down. My badge sat on the table inside, catching porch light like a small moon. My mother hummed in the kitchen a tune without fear in it. The tomatoes breathed in the dark. Somewhere a woman I didn't know turned a new lock and slept. I didn't need to come home unannounced anymore. Home announced itself.